The night the great flood came to Wexholt, the master of the house lay senseless in his bed, and the only person standing between 200 years of name and the rising water was a woman the household had been told to call nothing in particular. The candles had guttered hours ago. Rain struck the high windows of the east wing like thrown gravel, and the river that the family had always considered an ornament had climbed its banks and begun with a patient and terrible appetite to take the lower lawns. In the Duke's chamber the fever had him. He had ridden out 2 days before in weather no sensible man would have braved, returned soaked to the bone and shaking, and by the second evening he could not be roused past a murmur. The physician had been sent for and had not come, the bridge being already under. So, while the storm did its work, Annis Caro moved through the dark corridors with a lantern in one hand and a ledger of the house's weaknesses in her head, and she did the one thing no one had asked her to do. She decided the house would not be lost. To Wexholt, she was the housekeeper's assistant, which was a polite way of saying she was the woman who did the work no one else wished to claim. She had come to the estate 11 months earlier with a single trunk and a letter of character from a parish 2 counties away, and the senior staff had decided within a week that she gave herself airs. She read too well. She kept accounts in a hand finer than the steward's. She corrected the underfootman's arithmetic once, gently, and was never quite forgiven for it. What none of them knew was the shape of the life she had left, and she had no intention of telling them. If you have ever been the person in a room who is presumed to know less than they do, you will understand exactly how she held her tongue. Stay with me, because the night was only beginning and the house had not yet learned what it had in her. The Duke's mother had decided about Annis on the first morning. The Dowager Duchess of Wexholt, Lady Margaret, was a woman who had spent 61 years being correct about people, and she did not intend to be wrong now. She had watched Annis cross the entrance hall with a coal scuttle and had said to her companion, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that the new girl was a drudge with ideas, and that a drudge with ideas was the most tiresome thing a great house could harbor. The phrase had traveled below stairs by noon. By supper, Annis had heard it from the laundry maid, who repeated it without malice, the way one repeats the weather. A drudge with ideas. She had folded the words away with the rest of what she carried, and gone on lining the linen presses. She was 25 years old, and she had been until 2 years before the daughter of a country attorney who had taught her to read a contract before she could properly read a novel. Her father had died owing more than anyone had supposed, and the modest house she had grown up in had gone to his creditors. And the man she had expected to marry had discovered, with great regret and very little delay, that his affections had been misdirected. None of this had broken her, though it had cost her something she did not name even to herself. She had learned the difference between being unlucky and being worthless, and she guarded that distinction the way other women guarded a reputation. She did not expect Wexholt to be kind to her. She expected only to be useful, and to be paid, and to be left alone. The household had not left her alone, but it had at least settled into a shape she understood. There was the steward, Mr. Bellam, Mr. Dolan, Paul Rouen, who resented her competence and hid the resentment behind a great show of procedure. There was the Dowager, who ruled the family rooms from a chair by the morning room fire. There was the Duke himself, Edmund, the 7th of his line to hold the place, who had buried his younger brother 18 months before she arrived, and who walked through his own house like a man visiting a property he meant to sell. He spoke to the staff rarely, and never to her. She had formed no opinion of him beyond the one the whole house held, which was that grief had made him cold, and that the cold had set, the way a thing sets that is not going to soften again. That was the man who lay now in the great bed, with his face turned to the wall and his breath coming short, while the river took the lower garden 1 foot at a time. Annis had gone up to him at midnight, because the night nurse, a local woman, had fled at the first crack of thunder, to see to her own cottage, and not returned. She found him alone, the fire nearly out, the basin of cooling water untouched. She did what needed doing, She built the fire back, she wrung a cloth, and laid it across his brow. She got 3 spoonfuls of barley water past his lips. By the simple method of refusing to give up, he did not wake. Once in the depth of the fever, he said a name that was not hers and not his mother's, and she understood it was the brother. And she said nothing, because some things a person is owed the privacy of, even senseless. Then she heard the sound from below, a long groan of timber, and under it the unmistakable chuckle of moving water where no water should be. She took the lantern and went down. The cellars of Wexholt ran the length of the old house, and the river had found the coal-hole grating and was pouring in. Already the water stood a hand's breadth deep across the stone floor, and it was rising, and at the far end, behind a door, Mr. Tate, Polruan kept locked, lay the muniment room, where the deeds and the entail and 2 centuries of the family's papers were stored in oak chests upon the floor. Annis understood the geography of disaster at a glance. If the water reached the muniment room, the documents that proved Wexholt belonged to its duke at all would be pulp by morning. She also understood that she was one woman in the dark, with a storm overhead and a master who could not be woken to give an order. So, she gave the orders herself. She roused the house. She went up the back stair, calling names, and she did not call them softly. She got the boot boy and the 2 under-footmen and the cook's stout nephew out of their beds, and when the steward appeared in his nightcap to ask who had given her leave, she told him the river had given her leave, and that he might either carry chests or stand in the water explaining procedure to it. He chose, after a long, furious moment, to carry chests. She set the men a chain from the muniment room, up the cellar stair to the gun room above, and she took the worst place herself, the lowest step where the water was coldest, because she had learned long ago that you cannot ask people to stand in a cold river if you are not willing to stand in it first. They worked for 3 hours. The water came up to her knees and then past them, cold enough to take the breath from a person in a single hard pole, and it carried in it the smell of mud and old stone, and the river's iron patience. The lantern light shook on the black surface, and threw their shadows huge and trembling against the cellar arches. She kept the men steady with her voice, naming each chest as it came, so that no one panicked, calling out the rent rolls, the marriage settlements, the deeds, the sealed bundle of letters from the first duke's own hand, so that the work had names and was not merely a fight against water in the dark. She told the boot boy he was doing the work of a grown man and meaning it, and the boy, 14 and frightened white, stood straighter in the flood and passed the next chest along. The cook's nephew slipped once and went under to his shoulder and came up swearing, and she steadied him by the collar and told him, "Steady, steady," almost there, in the same low voice she might have used to a startled horse. When the largest chest, the oak one with the iron bands that held the entail itself, jammed in the doorway, and the water began to lap at its lid, she went down on her hands in the flood full length, her face an inch above the black surface, and felt along the bottom edge until she found the catch that had snagged on the worn stone. And she freed it with fingers she could no longer feel, and a strength she did not stop to question. By the time the gray came into the high windows, every chest, every ledger, every folded and sealed paper that mattered stood safe and dry in the gun-room, and the river had stopped its climb a single step below the muniment room threshold, as though it had been waiting only to see whether anyone would bother to fight it. No one had told the Duke. He slept through all of it, fever deep, while the woman the house called a drudge, with ideas saved the proof of everything he was. Morning came thin and cold over a drowned lawn. The storm had passed inland and left Wexholt an island, the bridge gone, the river still high and brown across the meadows. Annis did not go to bed. She changed into the only other gown she owned. She saw the exhausted men fed, and then she went back up to the Duke's chamber because the night nurse had still not returned and someone had to. She found his fever broken in the dawn and his eyes open. And for the first time in 11 months, the Duke of Wexholt looked directly at her. He did not know her. He knew only that a woman he could not place was sitting by his fire, in a plain wet-hemmed gown, with her hair, coming down and her hands wrapped in linen, and that the room smelled of river. "Where is the water?" he said. Not the nurse, not his mother. The water. She told him plainly what had happened in the night. The cellars, the muniment room, the chain of men, the chests now dry in the gun room. She told it without ornament and without claiming any part of it for herself, and when she finished, he was quiet. For a long moment, studying her with eyes the color of slate after rain. "Who carried the deeds?" he said. "We all did, Your Grace." "Who told them to?" She did not answer that, and her silence answered it, and something moved in his face that she could not read and did not trust herself to. "Sit down," he said. "You are about to fall down, and I will not have you doing it on my floor after a night like that." It was a command, level and certain, and she heard only the command. She sat, because her legs had in fact stopped consulting her, and she thought he was a hard man giving a hard order. She did not yet hear what was inside it. That was how it began, though neither of them would have called it a beginning. He was a duke, and she was a drudge with ideas, and the distance between those two things was the whole architecture of the world they lived in. The dowager heard the story before noon, and she heard it wrong, which is to say she heard it in the only way her categories allowed. To Lady Margaret, it was unthinkable that the salvation of Wexholt's papers should be credited to a servant. And so, in her account, the men had saved the papers, and the girl had merely been present, shrieking, as girls of that sort did. She came to her son's chamber to tell him so. Settling into the chair, Annis had risen from her diamonds out of place, against the mourning and the wreckage. "You must not let her make a tale of it," she told him. "These people invent themselves a heroism, and then expect to be raised for it. She is a drudge with ideas, Edmund. I have said so from the first." The phrase fell into the room a second time, in a second setting, from the same polished mouth. And the Duke said nothing, but he did not agree either. And his mother, who was used to his agreement, noticed the absence of it the way one notices a clock that has stopped. Annis, for her part, asked for nothing. She went back to her work. The house was half drowned, and there was a great deal of it. She had the carpets up and the ground floor rooms drying and the spoiled stores counted before the dowager had finished being affronted at breakfast. And here is the thing the Duke began to see, in the days that followed, when the flood had made his usual habit of not noticing impossible. He saw her everywhere, doing everything, and never once heard her speak of it. He had spent 18 months believing the world was a place that took from a man and offered nothing back. And now there was a woman in his house who had been given nothing and went on giving anyway. And the contradiction would not leave him alone. He found himself, in the slow marooned days, watching for her. A duke watching for the housekeeper's assistant is a thing that can be explained 100 dull ways, and Annis explained it every one of them to herself, each explanation neater than the last, and none of them quite holding. He came to the still room while she was setting the salvage stores to rights, the shelves of preserves she had counted, and the spoiled jars she had set aside, and he stood in the doorway longer than any errand required, asking her a question about the cellar drainage that he had no practical need to ask, and listening to her answer as though the answer mattered more than the drainage ever could. Another morning he came upon her in the long gallery with a list in her hand, and the wet carpets rolled along the wall, and he asked her abruptly where she had learned to keep accounts in such a hand, and she told him a parish clerk had taught her, which was true and was not the whole truth. And he looked at her a moment, as a man looks at a door he suspects is painted to seem like a wall. She felt the look, and bent again to her list, and did not let him see that she had felt it. Once when Polruan spoke to her sharply in the passage about a key, the Duke's voice came from a room she had not known he was in, quiet and final, telling the steward that Mrs. Caro would keep whatever keys she judged necessary. Mrs. Caro. He had given her the courtesy of a married woman's address, though she was not married, and the steward's face had gone the color of tallow, and Annis had stood very still in the passage and felt something she had no business feeling and put it down at once. The 4th day after the storm, The Duke saw the thing that decided him, though he would not have used that word. Intent. There was a child in the house, a boy of 7 named Tom, the son of the drowned-out gatekeeper, taken in until his family's cottage could be made dry. The dowager regarded the boy as one regards a wet dog in a drawing room. The other servants were too busy to mind him, and so the child had been drifting through the great damp house like a small ghost, frightened of the thunder that still came in the afternoons. The Duke, crossing the gallery, came upon a scene he was not meant to see. Annis was sitting on the floor, the actual floor, with the boy beside her, and she was reading to him from a book she had taken down from the library shelf without leave. She was reading a story about a fox who outwitted a king, and she was doing the fox's voice. And the boy was laughing. The first laughter the house had heard since the river rose. She did not know. The Duke watched. She read on, patient and warm, a woman who had stood to her knees in a freezing flood at midnight, now spending her one quiet hour giving a frightened child a king and a fox, and a reason to laugh. Edmund stood in the shadow of the gallery and did not breathe. He watched her tilt the book so the boy could see the picture of the fox, watched her stop to answer some small, grave question and answer it as though it were the most reasonable question in the world. Watched her hand smooth the boy's hair back from his forehead, in a gesture so unthinking and so tender that it undid something in the Duke's chest he had believed long since shut. He had a memory then, sudden and unwelcome, of his brother, at exactly that age, the two of them small in a window seat, while a voice he could no longer quite hear read them stories of foxes and kings, and of how long it had been, how very long, since anyone in this house had read a single word aloud or laughed at anything at all. He understood, watching her, that he had been wrong about something fundamental, and that the wrongness had been costing him every day for 2 long winters. Here was a woman with nothing, given nothing, owed nothing, sitting on a cold floor to spend the only quiet hour of her day on a child who could never repay her and would likely never remember it. He did not go in. He went away quietly, the way a man goes away from a thing too large to approach all at once. And that night at dinner he was so silent that even his mother left off speaking, and watched him down the table with the first faint shadow of unease. What the Duke carried, and what no one at Wexholt knew, came out only to himself, alone, in the cold hours. He had not failed to ride for the physician the night of the storm out of grief, alone. He had ridden, in fact, the wrong direction first, toward the churchyard, toward the new stone with his brother's name on it, because the anniversary of the death had been that very week, and he had not been able to keep himself away. His brother, Henry, had died of a fever, exactly like the one the river had nearly given him, 2 winters past, in a house full of people who had assumed someone else was watching, while Edmund was in London, being a duke. He had come home to a corpse, and a silence, and the certain knowledge that if one person, any person, had simply refused to give up on Henry the way Annis had refused to give up on him, his brother might have lived. He kept Henry's miniature in the breast pocket of every coat he owned. He had touched it without thinking when she told him who carried the deeds. That was the wound, named once and not again, the thing that had set his face into the cold the house mistook for pride. He had decided after Henry that to care was to be made a fool of by loss. And then a drudge with ideas had sat in the cold river all night for a man she had no reason to love, and the decision he had made about caring had begun, quietly, to come undone. The water went down. The bridge was rebuilt in rough timber. The world that had been suspended began to start again, and with it came the part of that world the Duke had been dreading, which was the marriage his mother had been arranging since before the flood, and meant now to conclude. Her name was Lady Sophia Vane, and she was everything the dowager believed a duchess ought to be. She arrived as soon as the bridge would bear a carriage, with her own maid and a quantity of trunks that suggested she did not mean to leave, and she was beautiful in the particular finished way of a woman who has been told since birth that her beauty is an asset to be deployed. She was not stupid, and she was not cruel exactly. She had simply never in her life encountered a situation her advantages could not resolve, and she did not expect Wexholt to be the first. The Dowager installed her in the best guest chamber, and began, with the patience of a general, to bring the engagement to its public announcement at the dinner she had planned for the county, the moment the roads allowed. Annis understood her position perfectly. She had been raised by an attorney. She knew the law of the world she lived in better than the people who benefited from it. A duke did not marry his housekeeper's assistant. A duke married a Lady Sophia, and the brief strange warmth of the maroon days would close over like water over a stone, and that was simply how it was. She did not permit herself to grieve it, because she had not permitted herself to hope for it, or so she told herself, in the still room, with her hands busy and her face composed. The body, though, kept its own accounts. When the Duke came into a room, her pulse told her before her eyes did. When his voice carried down a passage, she stopped without deciding to. She had spent 2 years learning to govern herself, and she found, to her quiet despair, that this one thing would not be governed. Lady Sophia took Annis's measure within a day, and found her, to her credit, interesting. She was too clever not to see what was in the house. She watched the Duke's eye travel to the plain woman in the doorway and travel back, and she watched the plain woman pretend not to notice, and she understood the situation with a worldly clarity the Dowager entirely lacked. It did not make her kind. It made her precise. At the second dinner, with the county beginning to assemble and the announcement 2 days off, she let fall in the drawing room, in the bright carrying voice of a woman who knows she will be repeated, that it was charming how the Duke's little flood had given the lower servants such ideas of themselves, and that she supposed the drudge with ideas was a natural consequence of a house left too long without a mistress. The phrase a third time, in a third setting, before the gathered county, and the room tittered, and Annis, who was at that moment carrying a tray of glasses past the open door, did not falter, did not drop a single glass, walked on with her chin level and her face still while the laughter followed her down the corridor. The Duke had heard it too. He stood by the window with a glass. He was not drinking, and his jaw set like carved stone. And he did not laugh, and his mother saw that he did not laugh. And the Dowager understood for the first time with a small, cold drop in her chest that her son might be about to do something that could not be undone. That was the night the dark thing happened. The Dowager, alarmed, now into action, did not wait for the announcement dinner. She went to Annis directly in the still-room, late, when the house was abed, and she did the practical, cruel thing that women of her position had always been able to do. She told Annis that her presence had become an inconvenience to the family, that a sum had been settled which would see her comfortably to a situation in the north, far from Wexholt, and that she would be on the carrier's cart by week's end. It was not phrased as a dismissal. It was phrased as a kindness, which made it worse. "You are not a foolish woman," she said, almost gently. "You know what you are, and what you are not. A drudge with ideas is still a drudge, and this is no place for you." She left the sum on the still-room table in a folded paper, and she went away, certain as she had always been certain that money settled what sentiment disturbed. Annis stood alone in the cold still-room with the folded paper on the table and made the choice that the whole of her life had been preparing her to make. She did not take the money. She left it folded and untouched where it lay. She would go, because she would not stay where she was not wanted and would not make a scene that could only end one way. She would go, though, on her own feet, and her own terms, owing this family nothing and carrying nothing of theirs. She packed her single trunk that night by candlelight. The last thing she did was the thing she could not help. She went up one final time to look in on the child Tom, asleep now in a cot off the kitchen passage, and she tucked the blanket to his chin, and she told the sleeping boy softly that he must be brave, and read to himself when there was no one to read to him. Then she sat by his cot, until the candle was nearly gone, because it was the last warm thing in the house that was glad of her, and she found she could not quite leave it yet. She did not know that the Duke, unable to sleep, walking his own house as was his habit, had heard her voice in the passage, and had stopped outside the kitchen door, and had heard every word she said to the sleeping child, and had understood at last completely, and without any possibility of denying it. Dissed exactly what his mother and Lady Sophia and the whole machinery of his rank were about to throw away. The announcement dinner went forward 2 days later because the Dowager willed it to. The great dining room at Wexholt, dried now and warmed by every candle the house owned, sat 30 of the county along its gleaming length, and at the head of it sat the Duke, and at his right his mother had placed Lady Sophia, and the engagement was to be announced between the second course and the third, with the senior peer of the district present to lend it weight. Annis was not at the dinner. Annis was, by the Dowager's arrangement, to be gone the following dawn, and she was upstairs that very evening seeing the last of her work done, because she was not a woman who left a task unfinished, even for the people discarding her. She could hear the murmur of the dinner rising up through the floors, the clink and the laughter, the sound of a future being settled without her. In it below, the Duke rose to speak. The room hushed for him, as rooms always had. The Dowager's hand rested easy on her fan. Lady Sophia composed her lovely face into the expression of a woman about to be given what she has been promised. The senior peer leaned back, benign, and the Duke of Wexholt looked down the length of the table at the assembled faces of the people, who had laughed in his drawing-room, and he did not say the thing every one of them had come to hear. "You came tonight," he said, "to see me announce a marriage. I will not waste your journey. I have an announcement." He let the silence build the way Annis had taught him silence could be built, that night, by his bed, without ever meaning to teach him anything. 2 weeks ago the river came into this house while I lay senseless with fever. Every document that proves Wexholt is mine, that proves any of us are who we say we are, would have been lost. It was not lost. One person in this house refused to let it be lost, stood to the waist in a freezing flood, through the whole of that night, and asked for nothing afterward, and was repaid by being called, in this room in your hearing. The Dowager's fan had stopped. Her name is Annis Caro, and I find I cannot announce one woman at this table while the only woman I mean to marry stands packed to leave my house at dawn. He did not raise his voice once. He set down his glass and he walked the length of his own dining room past 30 staring faces, past his mother whose hand had risen halfway to her throat, past Lady Sophia who had gone very white and very still, and who, to her lasting credit, understood the game was lost and did not stoop to contest it. He went out, and up the great stair, and the whole table heard his tread on the boards, and no one spoke, because there was nothing in any of their scripts for this. He found Annis in the upper passage, with her trunk corded and her traveling cloak already on. She had heard his step and she had not known what it meant, and she stood now facing him with the old composure held over the old wound like a hand over a flame. He stopped before her. The candlelight was on his face for once, all the cold gone out of it, and from the breast of his coat he drew the small, worn miniature he had carried for 2 winters, and held it a moment in his closed hand. And then he looked at her and said, the thing he had crossed his whole house to say, "Stay, be my wife, not my drudge." 5 words, and then 2 more, and the 7 of them ended the world she had been braced for, and began another she had not let herself imagine. She did not answer at once. The body answered first, the way it always had with him, her breath gone short and her hand finding the wall. Then she found her voice, the precise, honest voice she had kept for the things that mattered, and she asked him the only question that stood between them, which was whether he meant it, or whether the flood had simply unsettled a grieving man into a generosity he would regret. And he told her low and certain that he had spent 18 months deciding never to care for anything again, because caring had cost him his brother, and that she had walked into a freezing river and ruined the whole arrangement, and that he had no intention of letting the best thing the storm had washed into his house leave it on a carrier's cart. He opened his hand then and showed her the miniature, and told her once quietly who it was and what had happened, the wound named between them, and then sat down. She understood that he had given her the most private thing he owned. She put her hand, over the small painted face, and that was her answer. And he understood it, and neither of them needed to say anything further for a long moment in the candlelit passage, while below them the county sat in stunned and delicious silence. The dowager came up, of course. She came up because a woman who has been correct about people for 61 years cannot simply sit while she is proven wrong. What she found at the top of the stair was not a scene she could manage, but a thing already complete. Her son with his hand and the strange, clever servant's hand closed together over a portrait of the boy she, too, had lost. And the dowager, who was many things but was not in the end a fool, looked at her son's face and understood that the cold she had thought was permanent had broken like the fever had broken, and that she could keep her son and lose the argument, or win the argument and lose her son. She was not asked to be gracious. She chose it, in the smallest way, because it was that, or be alone. Henry would have liked her, she said, to no one, and it was the nearest to an apology she had in her. And her son heard it, and it was enough. They were married in the spring, when the river had gone back to being an ornament, and the lawns had grown green again over the place the flood had taken. It was not a grand wedding. The Duke had discovered in himself a distaste for grand occasions that surprised everyone but his wife. They were married in the small parish church, with the household in the pews, the under-footman who had stood in the chain, the cook and her stout nephew, Polruan grown grudgingly respectful, the dowager in the front pew with her diamonds and her hard-won grace. The boy Tom carried the ring on a cushion, and did not drop it, and was prouder of that than of anything in his short life. If their story moved you, stay a moment longer for the last of it, for the quiet part, which is the part that lasts. The following winter, the first snow came early to Wexholt, falling soft and thick over the meadows that the river had nearly carried away. In the library, where she had once taken down a book without leave to make a frightened child laugh, Annis sat now by the fire with that same book open on her knee. And the boy Tom, grown an inch and no longer afraid of thunder, sat at her feet, and she was reading him the story of the fox and the king while the snow came down past the tall windows. The Duke stood in the doorway, as he had stood that first time, except that now he did not hide in the shadow. He came in and sat, and he listened to his wife do the fox's voice, and on the small table beside her, where she could see it whenever she lifted her eyes, stood the miniature of his brother, no longer kept hidden in a breast pocket against the cold, but set out in the warm room among the living, in the new home she had made of the old house, where the boy laughed, and the fire held, and the snow fell on the windows she had fought a river to keep. She had come to Wexholt with one trunk and a letter of character and a thing the world had tried to tell her she was. She had been called a drudge, with ideas by every mouth in the house that mattered, and she had answered none of them. And in the end she had not needed to. The house knew what she was now. So did the man who had slept through the storm, and woken to find that the bravest thing in it had been standing by his bed the whole time. Thank you for staying until the end. If Annis stayed with you, leave a word below for the woman who fought the river alone and won, and the house that finally learned her name.